Welcome back to Family Shadows, the channel where we share heartfelt stories about family, sacrifice, and the quiet justice that shapes our lives. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive and reminds us all of the power of family and memory. Today's story is titled, "They Told Me to Stop Talking About Their Mom, so I built a scholarship in her name instead." Leonard Harper was not the kind of man who startled easily. 62 years of sanding oak planks, hammering nails through stubborn cedar, and steering boats down gray Washington waters had hardened him into something steady. Life had tested his patience the way salt tests the sea, slowly, without notice, until what remained was weathered and enduring. But that day, on a Tuesday in late September, he stopped cold. He had gone to his son's house, a tidy split level on the edge of Bellevue, just to drop off a set of tools Scott had borrowed months ago. Nothing dramatic. He'd even whistled on the drive over, the kind of soft, tuneless whistle a man falls into when the rain spits lightly on the windshield and memory keeps him company. Yet when he stepped into the living room, a silence greeted him that was louder than any thunder. The wall. The wall was bare. Once, it had been filled with her Margaret, or Maggie, as everyone called her. Her photos, smiling by the harbor, holding baby Hannah in a blue quilt, laughing at some forgotten joke while Scott clung to her arm. That wall had been their family's unspoken altar, a gallery of light that survived long after Maggie herself had been lowered into the earth. But now, only faint outlines remained. Dusty rectangles where frames had hung for years. Empty hooks, some still tilted at an angle, as if the pictures had been yanked down in a hurry. Leonard froze, still clutching the rusted toolbox in his left hand. He stared at the wall as though it were a wound. What happened here? His voice barely rose above a whisper. From the hallway came Scott, 35 years old, pressed shirt, phone in hand as always. He looked up, slightly startled to see his father standing there. "Dad, oh, you're early." Leonard didn't answer. He set the toolbox down with a thud on the hardwood floor, eyes fixed on the emptiness. "The pictures," he finally said. "Where are the pictures of your mother?" Scott shifted, clearing his throat. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to as a boy caught with broken glass in the yard. But his voice now carried none of the guilt, only certainty. "Dad, it was time. We needed to take them down for Ella, for Hannah, for all of us. Keeping them up, it just keeps everyone stuck." Leonard blinked. He almost laughed, except there was no humor to find. "Stuck." Scott sighed. "Dad, come on, it's been years. We can't keep living in the past. We need to move on." The words landed like stones, each heavier than the last. Move on. As if love were a train station you could simply depart from, ticket punched, luggage in hand. As if the face of the woman Leonard had kissed goodnight for 40 years could be packed into a cardboard box and carried to the attic without protest. His hand reached for the wall instinctively, fingertips brushing the faint dust line where Margaret's favorite picture once hung. Her in the garden, hair tied back with a red ribbon, sunlight painting her cheeks. He had taken that photo one Saturday morning, proud of the way the light found her the same way his eyes always did. And now it was gone. He turned back to Scott. The son's jaw was set, his phone buzzed in his palm. The world had little patience for reverence. "Scott," Leonard said, slowly, carefully, the way one might speak when balancing on a narrow dock. "Your mother is not clutter. She is not something to be stored away." Scott exhaled sharply, almost frustrated. "Dad, no one said she was, but constantly surrounding ourselves with those reminders, it makes it harder. For Hannah, for me, even for Ella. She doesn't even remember Grandma except through those pictures. It confuses her. Leonard's chest tightened. The idea that photographs could confuse a child, that love preserved in ink and frame could somehow harm, was beyond him. Before he could reply, a lighter step sounded behind them. Hannah appeared, her 31 years worn soft around the edges. Unlike her brother, she hesitated when she saw Leonard's expression. Her eyes flicked to the wall, then back to her father. "Dad," she started gently, but she didn't finish. Leonard caught it in her voice, the sympathy, yes, but also the silence of complicity. She had not stopped Scott. She had not protected the wall. For a moment, the house swirled around Leonard. The faint smell of lemon cleaner, the low hum of a dishwasher, the bright children's drawings pinned to the fridge. It should have felt like family. Instead, it felt like erasure. And in that moment, Leonard Harper, boat builder, widower, father, did something he rarely did. He fell silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because the words would not leave his throat. His fingers still rested on that bare patch of wall where memory had been evicted. The silence grew heavier, thicker, until even Scott shifted uneasily. Finally, Leonard drew his hand back. He forced a small, brittle smile. "I see." He bent down, picked up his toolbox, and straightened his back with the quiet dignity of a man refusing to show the weight he carried. "I'll be going," he said simply. Scott frowned. "Dad, don't make this a big deal. It's for the best." Leonard gave no answer. He stepped out into the late afternoon air, the smell of wet leaves rising from the yard. Behind him, the house closed like a door in more ways than one. He walked slowly to his truck, toolbox heavy at his side. As he climbed in, his eyes caught the faint reflection in the side mirror, a man aged not only by years but by the theft of memory. He started the engine, but for a long time he did not drive. He simply sat, staring at the steering wheel, the rain now streaking the glass like tears the sky itself could not contain. Some memories, he thought, you don't move on from. You carry them. You must, because to leave them behind is not progress. It is abandonment. And Leonard Harper had no intention of abandoning Margaret, no matter how bare the walls became. Leonard's truck groaned as he finally turned the key and steered onto the wet road. The rain had thickened, not yet a downpour, but heavy enough that the windshield wipers whispered a steady rhythm. S-H-H-H, 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 like the tide tugging back and forth. He drove slowly, his hands loose on the wheel, his mind drifting far from the pavement beneath him. Every street lamp reflected off the wet asphalt like a ghost of light. Bellevue's manicured lawns and trim hedges passed in a blur, but Leonard barely noticed. His chest still felt hollow, as if that bare wall had carved something out of him. He remembered when that photo wall had been born. It was Margaret's idea, of course. A house without faces, she had said, is just lumber and nails, but a wall of faces makes it home. She had spent an entire Saturday hammering hooks, measuring frames, stringing little strands of fairy lights across the top to make it glow at night. The kids had groaned. Scott, 12 at the time, had insisted it was silly, while Hannah, just 8, had begged to pick her favorite pictures. Margaret had insisted, with the determination only she possessed. By evening, the wall was a kaleidoscope of their life. Birthdays, fishing trips, boat launches, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper piled waist-high. Now, decades later, it was gone. Leonard's throat tightened as he thought of Scott's words, "We need to move on." He had heard the phrase before, though never from his children. People had whispered it at Margaret's funeral, back when the casseroles were delivered daily and neighbors shuffled in with damp eyes. Time to move on. She would want you to move on. What did people know? Moving on was a phrase invented by those eager to escape the discomfort of someone else's grief. It was not love's language. Leonard gripped the steering wheel tighter. He had loved Margaret since he was 19 years old. They had met at a community dance. She wore a green dress, simple, but it had swirled around her ankles like it carried the music itself. He had been too shy to ask her at first. When he finally did, she smiled so kindly it nearly knocked him to the floor. From then on, there had been no moving on. They had built everything together. The little starter home that smelled of cedar, the boat shop that kept bread on their table, the children whose first steps had been caught on film and framed on that wall. You don't move on from that. You carry it like a keel carries a ship. The road curved along Lake Washington. Leonard slowed, his eyes drawn to the water, black and restless under the rain. He remembered Margaret leaning over the dock, her laughter bouncing across the ripples as she scolded him for splashing too hard. The memory warmed him, then chilled him when he realized, if Scott had his way, even such memories would be boxed away, deemed a burden. By the time Leonard pulled into his driveway, the sky had darkened into a heavy slate. His own house was quiet as it always was these days. No voices, no clattering of pans, no hum of Margaret singing drifting from the kitchen. He carried the toolbox inside and set it down by the back door. The silence pressed against him. He moved through the room slowly, turning on one lamp then another, until the house glowed faintly golden. The living room walls still held her pictures. Frames lined the mantel, the shelves, the narrow hallway. Margaret smiling at a summer barbecue. Margaret holding a newborn Ella. Margaret kneeling in the dirt, planting tulips by the mailbox. Leonard sank into his recliner, staring at them as though drawing breath from their presence. His chest loosened just a little. At least here memory still lived, but a seed of unease had been planted. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. His son's face haunted him, the certainty, the insistence. Scott believed he was protecting the family. Maybe in some twisted logic he was right, but Leonard could not shake the image of Ella's little eyes searching the blank wall, wondering why her grandmother had been erased. Children learn what we teach them, he thought. If we teach them that memory is disposable, what kind of love will they grow into? He stood, restless, and walked to the shelf where Margaret's journals sat. She had kept them for years, filling page after page with neat cursive. Grocery lists, notes for school fundraisers, prayers whispered at night. Leonard pulled one down and opened it. On a page dated 1997, she had written, "If love means anything, it must mean remembering. Our children won't understand until they are older. But one day I hope they see that memory is not weight, it is wings." Leonard closed the book, pressing it to his chest. His throat burned. He crossed to the kitchen, made himself a cup of tea, though he barely drank it. The steam fogged his glasses as he stared out the window into the rain. He felt both anchored and adrift, anchored to Margaret's presence, adrift in his children's dismissal of it. When the clock struck 9, Leonard shuffled to his small workshop attached to the house. The scent of pine and varnish greeted him, as comforting as a friend's embrace. He ran a hand over the wooden hull of the half-built boat resting on sawhorses. Here at least he still knew who he was, a builder, a craftsman, a man who shaped wood the way life had shaped him. On the workbench lay an old notebook, worn at the edges, where he scribbled ideas and quotes. He opened it, uncapped his pen, and wrote carefully, "Memory is not a burden. Memory is duty." The ink bled slightly on the page, but the words felt strong. They were his truth. He sat for a long time, listening to the rain on the tin roof. At some point, he closed his eyes and let the rhythm carry him back to the sound of Margaret's voice, calling his name across the harbor, laughing when he pretended not to hear. The night stretched on. Leonard did not sleep easily. He dreamed of bare walls, of children packing boxes, of voices urging him to move on. And always at the center, Margaret stood, smiling but fading, until he reached desperately to hold her. When morning came, pale light creeping through the curtains, Leonard resolved one thing. If his children wanted to bury memory, then he would have to find a way to make it live louder than silence. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp air Seattle often saved for autumn. Leonard dressed simply, dark slacks, his flannel shirt, and a coat worn at the elbows. He had been invited to Scott's for dinner. Hannah would be there too with Ella. Normally, the thought of seeing his granddaughter brightened him. But tonight the invitation felt heavier, like a meeting where something unsaid hovered between the lines. He drove slowly, headlights catching fallen leaves scattered along the road. By the time he pulled up to Scott's driveway, the windows glowed warmly, laughter spilling faintly into the night. Leonard paused before stepping out. He sat for a moment with the engine ticking down, staring at that house where his son lived, where Margaret had once babysat Ella as a toddler. Then he pushed the door open and walked up the path. Inside, the table was already set. Hannah greeted him with a small hug, hesitant like always but genuine. Scott nodded from the kitchen, where he carved roast chicken with precise, hurried strokes. Ella bounded across the room, her hair in a braid, clutching a school project. "Grandpa, look, I made a collage at school. It's about my family." She unfolded a piece of poster board. Construction paper houses, stick figure drawings, photographs cut from old prints. Leonard's eyes found one instantly. Margaret holding baby Hannah in her arms. Ella had glued it right at the center. Leonard's throat tightened with pride and ache all at once. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said softly, running his hand over her hair. Scott's eyes flicked toward the collage. For the briefest second, his jaw tightened, then he looked away. Dinner began with the usual clatter of plates, silverware scraping lightly against porcelain. Leonard listened as Hannah asked Ella about school projects, as Scott talked about deadlines at work. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation, Leonard sensed something pressing. It came soon enough. Scott set down his fork, folded his hands on the table, and looked directly at his father. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened the other day." The room stilled. Hannah's hand froze halfway to her glass of water. Ella looked curiously from one face to another. Leonard placed his napkin carefully on his lap, eyes steady. "All right," he said. Scott leaned forward. "It's about Mom, about you bringing her up all the time." Leonard's chest tightened. The words, though expected, still stung. "Bringing her up," he echoed. "Yes." Scott's tone was firmer now. "Dad, I know you miss her, we all do, but constantly talking about her, it keeps everyone trapped. It's not healthy. It makes things harder, especially for Ella." Ella blinked, confused. "But I like hearing about Grandma," she said softly. Scott forced a thin smile toward his daughter, then turned back. "She's too young to understand. Hearing stories every time, it's not fair." Leonard's jaw shifted, though his voice remained calm. "Scott, your mother is not a ghost story. She's part of who we are." "Dad," Scott interrupted, "I'm asking you to stop. Just stop bringing her into every conversation. We have to move forward." The words hit like a hammer. Across the table, Hannah lowered her gaze, unable to meet her father's eyes. She fiddled with her napkin, caught between love and silence. Leonard studied his children in the warm light of that dining room. The roast chicken, the mashed potatoes, the gentle hum of the dishwasher in the background, all of it seemed absurdly normal while inside his chest, a storm gathered. He turned to Ella, who was still staring at the collage she had made. The photo of Margaret smiled up from the paper, unbothered by arguments. Leonard drew a slow breath. "Ella, what do you think when you see pictures of your grandmother?" The child looked up, eyes bright. "I think she looks kind. Mommy says she used to sing me lullabies when I was a baby. I don't remember, but when I see her picture, I feel like I do." Hannah reached out, touched her daughter's hand lightly. A flicker of emotion crossed her face. Scott's lips pressed thin. "Dad, you see, that's exactly it. She's remembering something she never lived. It confuses her." Leonard's hand clenched under the table, the wood pressing hard against his palm. He could hear Margaret's voice in his head, the way she used to say, "Children grow stronger when they stand on the shoulders of those who came before." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Scott," he said slowly, carefully, "confusion is not what I see. What I see is connection. She feels loved by someone she can't remember because we carry that love to her. If we hide it, if we pretend Margaret never existed, then Ella learns that love is temporary, disposable." Scott pushed back slightly in his chair. "That's not what I said." "It's what you're doing," Leonard replied, his tone firmer now. Silence fell, broken only by the clink of Ella's fork as she poked at her peas. Hannah's eyes glistened, though she still said nothing. Leonard leaned back, weary. He didn't want to argue at his son's table, but the weight of Scott's request, that silence, that erasure, pressed on him like water against a hull. He thought of Margaret's journals, the words about memory being wings. He thought of the bare wall of dust lines where laughter had once hung. He thought of his granddaughter clutching a collage with her grandmother's smile in the center. And he thought, if they want silence, then I must find another way to make memory speak. He reached for his glass of water, took a sip, and let the coolness settle his rising anger. When he set it down, his voice was steady. "I will not stop remembering your mother," he said simply. "Not for me and not for Ella." Scott exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Dad, you're impossible." Perhaps he was, but Leonard knew impossibility was sometimes another word for faithfulness. The conversation stumbled onward into safer subjects after that: school schedules, upcoming holidays, but the fracture remained. Leonard ate little, his appetite stolen by the heaviness pressing on the room. Later, as coats were gathered and dishes stacked, Ella slipped her collage into Leonard's hands. "Keep it at your house, Grandpa," she whispered, "so Grandma can stay on the wall there." Leonard's eyes misted. He kissed her forehead, tucked the poster under his arm, and stepped once more into the night. The stars were faint above the city's glow, but he lifted his gaze anyway. Somewhere, he thought, Margaret was watching. Somewhere, she knew he would not let her name be silenced. The house welcomed him with silence, not the busy kind of silence, filled with footsteps or muffled conversation in other rooms. This was the silence of a place that had learned to hold only one man's breathing. Leonard set the collage gently on the kitchen table, as if it were glass. He turned on a lamp in the corner, and the soft amber light spread across the room, catching on picture frames that still hung proudly along his walls. Margaret's smile shone back at him from every angle, perched on the bow of their first boat, flower on her cheek from a Thanksgiving pie, her arm around a much younger Leonard with hair still thick and dark. He dropped his coat over the chair, loosened his collar. His body felt heavy, but his mind restless. The dinner conversation replayed itself again and again, every word sharper in memory than it had been in the moment. "Stop talking about Mom. It's confusing, Ella. We have to move forward." Leonard sat at the table, elbows resting on the wood, his hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked at the poster board collage. Ella had glued every picture slightly crooked, her handwriting large and uneven, but at the very center was Margaret, smiling, holding baby Hannah. He reached out, tracing her outline with a fingertip. His breath caught. For a long while he sat that way, the room hushed except for the tick of the old wall clock. Eventually he rose and walked into the den. There, in a cedar trunk tucked beneath the window, lay the heart of his private world, Margaret's keepsakes. He pulled it open, the hinges creaking like old bones. Inside were her journals, a stack of folded scarves, faded Polaroids bound with rubber bands, even a dried bouquet from their 40th anniversary. He lifted a scarf, blue with little stitched flowers at the corners. It still held the faintest trace of her perfume, lavender and soap. He pressed it to his face and closed his eyes. In the darkness of memory, she was there again. He could almost hear her humming while folding laundry or laughing in the kitchen when the bread burned. He remembered the way she said his name when she needed him to fix something, half command, half music. He set the scarf aside carefully and reached for one of the journals. The leather cover was worn soft, the edges frayed. He opened it to a page from years ago, her handwriting neat but hurried. "The children grow so fast. I wonder if they'll remember these small days when they are older. Memory matters. It holds love when nothing else can." Leonard closed the journal, pressing his thumb against the spine. His chest swelled with both ache and determination. The night deepened outside. Rain began again, tapping on the window like insistent fingers. Leonard carried the journal and scarf to his workshop, needing the familiar smell of wood and varnish to ground him. The boathouse was cool, dimly lit by a single bulb. On the workbench sat the half-built boat, its frame sturdy, waiting for his hands to shape it into something whole. He placed Margaret's journal beside it, open to that page, and stared at the words as if they were instructions for more than carpentry. Memory holds love when nothing else can. He sat heavily on the stool, his body weary but his heart restless. He picked up his pencil and wrote in his own notebook, "If they want silence, then I must find another voice for her name. Something that outlives walls, arguments, even time." He paused, tapping the pencil against the wood. He didn't yet know what that voice would be, but the thought gave him a strange kind of peace. For hours he tinkered in the shop, sanding, planing, letting the rhythm of the work steady his breathing. Each stroke seemed to carry Margaret closer, not further away. She had always loved the boats, though she teased him that he spent more time with sawdust than with her. He could still picture her leaning against the doorway, a cup of tea in hand, watching him work. Near midnight, Leonard put down his tools. He stood back from the boat, brushing dust from his hands, and whispered into the empty air, "I won't let them forget you, Maggie." His voice echoed faintly against the walls, swallowed by the night. Back inside, he prepared for bed. He placed Ella's collage on the dresser, propping it against the mirror. From where he lay, he could see Margaret's picture smiling softly at him, surrounded by the uneven cutouts his granddaughter had glued. Leonard fell asleep with that image before him. His dreams were muddled but vivid. Margaret walking along the harbor, calling out to him over the crash of waves. Scott turning the pictures face down one by one, Ella holding a candle, insisting it stay lit. When he woke, the early gray light filtered through the blinds. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face, and thought, "If they believe memory is a chain, then I will show them it is a compass." The idea was still foggy, not yet formed, but it stirred inside him like a tide beginning to rise. Sunday morning arrived gray and damp, as most Sundays in the Pacific Northwest tended to do. Mist clung to the branches outside Leonard's kitchen window, softening the world into watercolor. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and strong, and stared at the steam curling upward as though it might carry a prayer of its own. Church had not been easy since Margaret's passing. For years they had sat side by side in the second pew from the back, her hand sometimes slipping into his during hymns, her voice weaving soft harmony into the choir of the congregation. Walking in alone still felt like stepping into an echo, but today something in him needed to be there. He shrugged on his coat, took one last glance at Ella's collage propped on the dresser, and headed out. The little white church stood on a hill, its steeple barely visible against the gray sky. Cars lined the gravel lot. Leonard parked and walked slowly, nodding at neighbors, shaking a hand or two. They greeted him kindly but without fuss. Grief had taught them to measure their words carefully around him. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with stained glass light. Reds and blues spilled across the wooden pews, bathing the room in quiet color. Leonard slid into his usual place near the back. He inhaled the familiar scent of old hymnals and polished wood. It steadied him. The service began with music, gentle chords from the piano, voices rising, children fidgeting in their parents' arms. Leonard sang softly, his baritone low, carrying the tune even if his heart stumbled over the words. He felt Margaret beside him in memory, her voice just out of reach. Then came the sermon. Father Lewis, a man in his late 50s with kind eyes and a steady presence, stepped up to the pulpit. He was not a showman. He never raised his voice unnecessarily, but when he spoke, people listened because he carried truth like a lantern. Today, he began, I want to speak about memory. Leonard's head lifted. We often think of memory as a weight, Father Lewis continued. Something heavy that keeps us anchored to the past, unable to move forward. But I believe memory is not a chain. Memory is a lamp. It lights the path behind us so that we may see where we've been, and it lights the path ahead so we may walk with wisdom. Murmurs of assent moved softly through the congregation. I know some of you carry grief, Father Lewis went on, his gaze sweeping gently across the room. The names of loved ones spoken less and less each year, their faces fading from photographs on the wall. We are tempted to silence ourselves, to think remembering them is selfish or unhealthy. But love is not diminished by memory. Love is fulfilled by it. To remember is to honor, and to honor is to keep love alive. Leonard's throat tightened. He stared at his hands, folded in his lap as though the words had been carved directly into him. Think of the stories we tell our children, Father Lewis said. Stories of grandparents, of sacrifices, of kindness that shaped us. If we silence those stories, what are we teaching them? That love is temporary, that lives vanish the moment they end. No, we must teach them that memory is a duty of love, that through remembering we build bridges across generations. Leonard's eyes blurred. He blinked quickly, swallowing hard, but the tears slipped free anyway. He wiped them with the back of his hand, not ashamed, just exposed. He thought of Ella's collage, her little hands gluing down Margaret's face at the center. He thought of Scott's bare wall, of Hannah's silence at the table. He thought of Margaret's journal, her words about memory being wings. Father Lewis closed the sermon simply. Let us not bury memory out of fear. Let us let it guide us as a lamp guides a traveler in the night. The final hymn rose, voices blending in familiar chords. Leonard sang softly, but this time his chest felt fuller. The words settled deep, not as comfort only, but as instruction. After the service, people mingled in the fellowship hall, sipping coffee and nibbling cookies. Leonard stood apart at first, leaning against a wall, lost in thought. Father Louis approached quietly, his hand warm on Leonard's shoulder. "It's good to see you here," the pastor said. Leonard nodded. "I wasn't sure I'd come." "I'm glad you did." Father Louis's eyes searched his face. "How are you holding up, really?" Leonard hesitated. He had answered that question hundreds of times with the same polite line, "I'm fine," but today something cracked open. "They want me to stop talking about her," Leonard said quietly. Father Louis's brow furrowed. "Who?" "My children, Scott especially. He says it keeps us stuck, that it confuses Ella." The pastor's eyes softened, sorrow mingling with understanding. "And what do you believe?" Leonard swallowed. "I believe forgetting her would kill me, and it would cheat Ella of knowing the love that shaped her family." Father Louis squeezed his shoulder gently. "Then you know your answer. Sometimes love means standing firm even when others don't see it yet." Leonard nodded, emotion pressing against his chest. "But how do I make them see? Words only make them push back." The pastor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Then perhaps it's not words you need, perhaps it's action. A way of remembering her that no one can deny." The thought lodged in Leonard's mind like a seed. Action, not just words, something lasting. He thanked the pastor, shook a few hands, and stepped back into the damp afternoon. The mist had thinned, the sky softening into pale blue. Leonard breathed deeply, feeling a strange kind of resolve forming, though its shape was still unclear. As he walked down the steps, he thought of Margaret again, not just her smile, but the way she had poured herself into community. She had organized bake sales for the school, raised money for uniforms, slipped envelopes into church donations even when money was tight. She believed giving was remembering. The seed in Leonard's mind stirred again. Perhaps the way to honor her was not simply to speak her name, but to let her name live through something she loved. He climbed into his truck, the pastor's words echoing, "Perhaps it's action." The engine rumbled to life, but Leonard sat for a long while in the church lot, staring at the cross on the steeple, feeling the shape of an idea rise slowly inside him, like a boat beginning to take form from bare wood. The week passed slowly, each day marked by the usual rhythms of Leonard's solitary life. The kettle hissing in the morning, the groan of his workshop door, the steady scrape of sandpaper against wood. Yet beneath the surface something new stirred. He kept replaying Father Louis's words, "Perhaps it's not words you need, perhaps it's action." Leonard had scribbled those lines into his notebook, circling them again and again. Action, something lasting, something that would speak Margaret's name when his own voice one day fell silent. But before he could shape the idea fully, another dinner invitation arrived. Hannah called, her voice tentative. "Dad, come over Friday. Ella's been asking for you. Scott's making lasagna." Leonard hesitated but agreed. He could not refuse Ella, not when her bright eyes had been the only spark of comfort at the last meal. Friday evening found him walking up the familiar path again, the porch light glowing against the autumn dusk. He carried a small wooden box under his arm, something he had carved years ago for Margaret to hold her recipe cards. Tonight, he had filled it with family photos, old prints he could not bear to leave behind. Inside, the smell of garlic and tomatoes greeted him, warm and rich. Hannah welcomed him with a gentle hug, and Ella rushed forward, wrapping her arms around his legs. "Grandpa," she chirped. Scott emerged from the kitchen, apron still tied, his expression polite but guarded. "Dad," he said with a short nod. They gathered around the table, plates steaming with lasagna, salad, and bread. At first, the conversation was light. Ella's school project, Hannah's work schedule, a neighbor's new puppy. Leonard listened quietly, the wooden box resting beside his chair, a weight both physical and symbolic. Halfway through the meal, Ella turned toward him, her eyes shining. "Grandpa, can you tell us a story about Grandma again?" The table stilled. Scott's fork froze in midair. Hannah's eyes darted between her daughter and her father. Leonard smiled softly at his granddaughter. "Of course, sweetheart. Did I ever tell you about the time your grandmother tried to learn how to row?" Ella shook her head eagerly. "She was stubborn," Leonard began, his voice warming. "She thought rowing looked easy. She wanted to surprise me by taking the boat out herself one morning. But when I came down to the dock, there she was, halfway turned in circles, laughing so hard she could barely hold the oars. I had to wade in just to bring her back, and she teased me the whole way." Ella giggled, her eyes wide with delight. But Scott set his fork down hard. The sound clattered against the plate. "Dad." Leonard looked up slowly. "I thought we talked about this," Scott said, his voice tight. "We agreed this isn't healthy. Ella doesn't need to be hearing these stories all the time." "Scott," Hannah started, but her voice faded. "No," Scott pressed, leaning forward. "We asked you to stop. You keep bringing her up like we're stuck in the past. It's not fair to Ella. It's not fair to us." Leonard's jaw tightened. He kept his voice steady. "She asked me, Scott. She wanted to know about her grandmother." "She's 10 years old," Scott snapped. "She doesn't even remember Mom. She's just clinging to stories that make it harder for all of us to move forward." Ella's face fell, her small hands tightening around her fork. "But I like hearing about her," she whispered. Scott closed his eyes briefly, exhaling in frustration. "Dad, please, enough." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Hannah's eyes glistened, her lips pressed shut. She reached for her daughter's hand under the table, as though to shield her from the storm. Leonard looked at his children, the son who had hardened himself into practicality, the daughter too timid to break the silence, the granddaughter caught in the crossfire. His heart ached with a weight heavier than any cedar beam he had ever carried. Slowly, he reached down and lifted the wooden box onto the table. He slid it forward, the photos inside shifting softly. "I brought these," he said quietly. "Memories. Not to trap you, not to burden you, but to remind you who we are. Your mother is not a chain. She is the root of this family." Scott's face flushed. "Dad," I said, "stop." Leonard cut him off, his voice low but firm, stronger than they had heard in years. "If remembering her hurts you, then forgetting her will kill me." The room fell silent. Even Hannah looked up, startled by the sharpness in his tone. Ella's eyes brimmed with tears she did not understand. Leonard took a slow breath, steadying himself. He opened the box, lifting a photo. Margaret in her green dress at the community dance, her smile radiant, his own young face beside hers. He set it gently in the center of the table. "This is not just the past," he said. "This is the reason any of us are sitting here. You can clear walls, you can box up pictures, but you cannot erase her, and I will not let you." The lasagna steamed between them, untouched now. The air felt heavy, charged. Scott leaned back, shaking his head. "Dad, you're impossible." Leonard looked at him, eyes steady. "No, son, I'm faithful." The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Hannah pressed her napkin to her lips, eyes wet. Ella stared at the photo on the table, her small voice breaking the stillness. "Grandma looks happy." Leonard reached over, squeezed her hand gently. And though the conversation shifted awkwardly back to other topics, though Scott avoided his father's gaze for the rest of the meal, Leonard knew something had shifted. His words had been spoken, firm and clear, and he could not take them back. As he drove home later that night, the wooden box on the seat beside him, Leonard gripped the wheel with new resolve. Words alone would never convince his son. He needed something stronger, something lasting, something that would outlive even argument. It was 2 weeks later when the invitation came again, this time from Hannah. "Dad," she said on the phone, her voice hesitant, "Scott wants to host Sunday dinner. He said he wants to clear the air." Leonard almost refused, but something inside him told him to go. Not with words alone this time, but with the decision he had quietly set in motion since that night at church. Sunday arrived crisp, leaves scattering in gold and rust along the sidewalks. Leonard wore his flannel pressed slacks and carried a thin folder tucked beneath his arm. The weight of it steadied him. At the table, the meal began politely, almost too politely. Scott kept his tone neutral. Hannah moved food carefully from dish to plate. Ella chattered about a school field trip to the science museum. But underneath, the tension lingered, a taut wire stretched across the table. Midway through the meal, Leonard cleared his throat. "There's something I need to say." Scott set down his fork, already bracing. Hannah froze. Ella looked up, curious. Leonard's hands rested on the folder before him. His voice was low, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "I have listened to you. I have heard your request that I stop speaking your mother's name, but tonight I cannot stay silent any longer." Scott exhaled, frustration flaring. "Dad, let me finish." Leonard interrupted, his voice firm, more forceful than his children were used to hearing. The room fell still. Even Ella's eyes widened at the sharp edge in her grandfather's tone. Leonard took a slow breath, steadying himself. He looked at each of them in turn, his son, rigid and restless, his daughter, torn by loyalty, his granddaughter, innocent and eager for love. "If remembering her hurts you, then forgetting her would kill me," he said, "and I will not die before my time." He slid the folder open. Inside were documents neatly clipped together, bearing the letterhead of MS, Preston's law office. "I have established the Margaret Harper Memorial Scholarship Fund," he announced. "It will provide support for local students who dream of studying, but lack the means. It will carry her name, her spirit, her generosity long after I am gone." Scott blinked, stunned. "Dad, what?" "With MS. Preston's help, I've set aside my savings and proceeds from the workshop. The fund is already signed, already active." Leonard's voice steadied with each word like the keel of a boat in rough seas. "From now on, when her name is spoken, it will not be as a shadow of the past. It will be as a light for the future." The silence was absolute. Hannah's hand went to her mouth, her eyes brimming. Ella leaned forward, her small voice breaking the stillness. "A scholarship, like for kids who need help." Leonard nodded, his gaze softening as it fell on her. "Yes, sweetheart, for kids who need someone to believe in them the way your grandmother always did." Ella's smile bloomed slowly, shy but bright. "That's nice, Grandpa." Scott shook his head, rubbing his temples. "Dad, you didn't even tell us." "No," Leonard said firmly. "Because if I had, you would have argued. You would have told me it was foolish or sentimental or living in the past. But this is not about the past. This is about honoring the woman who made this family and teaching the next generation that love does not vanish when a person does." His eyes fixed on his son's, unwavering. "You may contribute to this fund or you may remain silent. That is your choice, but her name will live with or without your permission." The words dropped like anchors into the room. No one moved for a long time. Finally, Hannah's tears spilled. "Dad, it's beautiful," she whispered. "It's exactly what she would have wanted." Leonard's hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder, but his heart beat strong. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had stood fully in his truth without apology. Across the table, Scott said nothing. His face was unreadable, but his silence was not victory. It was simply the sound of a man confronted with something larger than his arguments. Leonard leaned back, weary but resolute. He had broken the silence, not with anger but with action, and there was no going back. The week after the dinner, the folder never left Leonard's desk. It sat in plain view, a reminder that what he had spoken was not just a declaration but a promise already set in motion. On Tuesday afternoon, he drove into town to meet with Ms. Preston. Her office was a modest brick building tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. Inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Certificates lined the wall, each a quiet proclamation of trust and professionalism. "Mr. Harper," Ms. Preston greeted him warmly as he entered. She was a precise woman in her 40s, glasses perched low on her nose, her voice steady without being cold. "Come in. Everything is ready for your review." Leonard followed her into the conference room where a neat stack of documents lay waiting. "As we discussed," Ms. Preston explained, sliding the papers toward him, "the Margaret Harper Memorial Scholarship Fund is legally established. It's structured as a trust, which means the principal remains protected while the earnings provide scholarships each year. The first round of awards can be announced by spring." Leonard listened carefully, nodding, though the legal terms washed over him like rain on a roof. What mattered wasn't the technicalities. What mattered was that Margaret's name now stood inked on official documents, carved into permanence beyond anyone's silence. Ms. Preston continued, "We've drafted a mission statement in your words that the fund will support students pursuing education in fields of craftsmanship, teaching, and community service, areas your wife valued deeply. Does that sound right?" Leonard's eyes misted. "Yes," he said quietly. "That sounds like her." He signed the documents with a steady hand. For a moment, as the pen scratched across the paper, he felt Margaret's presence beside him, her hand on his shoulder the way she used to when he bent over blueprints in the workshop. When it was done, Ms. Preston smiled softly. "You've honored her beautifully, Mr. Harper. This fund will carry her memory forward for generations." He nodded, folding the papers carefully back into the folder. "Thank you. That's all I wanted, for her name to live." That Sunday, Leonard sat in his workshop with Ella perched on a stool beside him. Sawdust floated in shafts of afternoon light as he planed the edge of a board. "Grandpa," Ella asked, her voice curious, "what's a scholarship?" Leonard set down his tool, wiping his hands on a rag. He leaned closer. "It's a gift, sweetheart. Money to help kids go to school when they can't afford it. Your grandmother believed everyone deserves a chance to learn, no matter how little they have." Ella's eyes widened. "So, Grandma's name is going to help other kids." Leonard smiled, the corners of his mouth trembling. "Yes, every year children who never knew her will still be touched by her kindness. They'll read her name, they'll feel her spirit. That way she'll never be forgotten." Ella hugged him tightly, her little arms fierce around his neck. "I love that." Leonard closed his eyes, holding her, whispering in his heart, "Maggie, you lived through her." Word of the scholarship spread quickly in their small community. At church, Father Lewis announced it from the pulpit. "In honor of Margaret Harper, a scholarship has been established to bless future generations. Let us give thanks for love that does not end with life." Congregants murmured in admiration, some clapping softly, others bowing their heads. Hannah wept openly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Even Scott, seated stiffly beside her, lowered his gaze. his jaw working as though caught between pride and resistance. After the service, neighbors approached Leonard, pressing his hand, telling him what a gift he had given. Stories of Margaret resurfaced, how she had once stayed late after a bake sale, cleaning every pan, how she had visited a sick neighbor with soup, how her laughter had filled the town hall during school fundraisers. It was as if, by speaking her name aloud again, Leonard had opened a floodgate. At dinner later that evening, the family gathered once more. The folder sat in the middle of the table, its presence undeniable. "I want you both to see," Leonard said, opening the papers for his children. "This isn't about clinging to the past, it's about giving her love a future." Hannah leaned over, her tears falling onto the pages. "Dad, it's perfect. She would be so proud." Scott stared at the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. I didn't think you'd actually do it." Leonard's eyes met his son's, calm but firm. "I told you, Scott, you may contribute or you may remain silent, but her name will live." Scott's lips pressed tight, but he said nothing more. Silence was all he could manage, and silence was no longer enough to erase her. Ella, still too young to grasp legal trusts or mission statements, leaned forward and pointed to her grandmother's name written boldly on the letterhead, Margaret Harper Memorial Scholarship. She grinned. "Look, Mommy, Grandma's name is on a real paper, like it's famous." The adults smiled despite themselves, and in that moment the truth became unshakable. Margaret Harper's memory had moved from fragile photographs to a living legacy. That night, when Leonard returned home, he set the signed trust documents on the mantel beneath Margaret's picture. He lit a candle beside it, the flame flickering in the dim room. He whispered into the stillness, "They told me to stop talking about you, but now, Maggie, the world will keep speaking your name." And for the first time in years, the silence of his house felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Winter crept into the valley quietly, draping frost along rooftops and leaving its breath on the windows each morning. Leonard moved more slowly these days, but he moved with a steadiness that came from having placed something permanent into the world. The scholarship was announced publicly in March. Flyers were posted at the high school, notices mailed to the church bulletin, the town newsletter carrying Margaret Harper's name on its front page. New Memorial Scholarship honors local woman's legacy. The day the first thank you letter arrived, Leonard held it carefully, as though it might dissolve if handled too roughly. A young girl named Emily wrote in careful penmanship, "Dear Mr. Harper, I never knew your wife, but because of her, I can now go to college and study teaching. I promise to carry her kindness forward." Leonard read the words aloud to Ella as she sat beside him at the kitchen table, swinging her legs. She listened wide-eyed, then clapped her hands together. "Grandma is helping kids even though she's in heaven." Tears blurred Leonard's vision, but he smiled through them. "That's right, sweetheart. That's exactly right." One Sunday afternoon, Hannah arrived with Ella carrying a framed photo. Margaret, younger, laughing in the garden. Hannah set it gently on the mantel beside the candle Leonard had lit months earlier. "I thought it belonged here," Hannah said softly. Her voice broke slightly. "I should have stood up for you sooner, Dad. I'm sorry." Leonard touched her hand. "You were caught between love and silence. I understand, but now you've chosen love." Hannah's tears fell and she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Ella skipped to the mantel, pointing proudly at the photo and the scholarship certificate displayed beside it. "Now, everyone who comes here will know Grandma was important." Leonard's heart swelled, the quiet justice he had longed for finally at rest. Scott remained more distant, his pride unwilling to bend easily. But one evening, as Leonard locked up the workshop, a car pulled into the drive. Scott stepped out, hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cold. "Dad," he said after a long pause, "I read one of the letters from that girl, the one who wants to be a teacher." Leonard waited, silent. Scott shifted uncomfortably. I guess Mom would have liked that. She always believed in helping." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Leonard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. She would have liked it very much. For the first time in years, Scott didn't pull away. That night, Leonard sat alone in his chair, fire crackling in the hearth, the house glowing with warmth. He looked at Margaret's picture, her smile eternal, her name now echoing through the lives of children who would never meet her yet would carry her kindness onward. He closed his eyes, whispering, "Memory is a duty of love." And in the quiet, he felt her presence, not as grief, but as peace. Thank you for listening to this story on Family Shadows. These tales remind us that love, memory, and sacrifice never vanish. They live on in the choices we make for one another. If you found meaning here, please consider subscribing to our channel to hear more stories like this. From our family to yours, may you be blessed with health, peace, and happiness in your homes. Cherish your loved ones, hold your memories close, and may your family always be your greatest legacy.